Now, reports by the Criminal Justice Inspectorate has found that despite cultural change in how domestic abuse is dealt with in the justice system, and that means the police and the courts and everything else besides, that more needs to be done. The Chief Inspector of Criminal Justice in Northern Ireland is Jacqui Durkin. She's in the studio with us. And Jacqui, just to talk a little bit about the background to this Act obviously came in, this new domestic abuse law came in 2022, and you've been tasked as part of that with looking at it and seeing whether or not it's working. This is the second time you've looked at it. The first time you made a bunch of recommendations. How many of them have actually come to fruition?
So, good morning, Chris and Sarah. So, the Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act is a really effective tool in creating a domestic abuse offence, and also how domestic abuse and violence is dealt with in Northern Ireland. So the Act very clearly said, and the intention of the Assembly was that it was reviewed annually for at least 7 years, and the Minister of Justice has asked me to do that. So the first year that we did the review, we made 11 recommendations for improvement, and the second year is going back to look at how those recommendations have been implemented. And I'm really encouraged to say that 8 of the recommendations, there's either been good or reasonable progress, but there are 3 that there's meaningful or no meaningful or insufficient progress towards implementation. And we would expect...
There was one where there was absolutely no progress whatsoever, wasn't there?
Well, what we've said in this review is we're not expecting full implementation, but we need to see evidence of action being taken. And that's really important to make sure that the intention of the Act is fulfilled, and that's about keeping people safe in their homes, and that when domestic abuse is investigated and prosecuted, there are effective outcomes for victims and witnesses. This Act has been really important in highlighting the problem of domestic abuse and violence in our community, and particularly the impact on children.
I think one of the other we'll talk about Operation Encompass in a moment, because that's the part of it where kids can talk to their teachers about what's going on at home, and it's been rolled out across all schools, and I think it's fair to say it's been very effective. The number of kids coming forward is very frightening, but it seems to have been working very, very well. But the other side of this is, the other piece that seems to be working well is a full cultural shift within the PSNI and within the court service, the public prosecution service, I should say, that you've identified. How do you measure that?
Well, it's system-wide, system-wide across the criminal justice system. Yes, we were pleased that we'd seen encouraging signs that there was a better level of awareness about domestic violence and abuse in response to it. In terms of measurement, inspectors speak to people in every criminal justice organisation that we inspect. We look for evidence of raising awareness through training, through surveys, through looking at how people are being skilled up to deal with domestic abuse and violence, and also their awareness when you're in looking at particular organisations and talking to staff and examining files. Is there evidence that the Act has been implemented as intended, that aggravators in the Act have been identified and used in investigations and prosecutions?
Let's then talk about the areas where it just hasn't come up to scratch. Essentially, domestic abuse training in the PSNI and elsewhere, you're not satisfied with that?
Well, the inspection recommendation, the first review that we did in year one of the recommendations was about targeted training for contact management centre staff, and those are really vital PSNI staff who triage cases as they're reported and undertake threat, harm and risk assessments, which are vital when victims come forward, to make sure that if those levels of risk to them or potentially children in their home, that's dealt with properly. So we were disappointed that face-to-face training hadn't taken place as we'd hoped for. There was only one session with 8 staff attended in the year that we looked at, and that 4% of the staff in the contact management centre over a 12-month period had training.
Can I just ask you, Jacqui, just sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to ask, are those training, the money for that training, does that have to come out of the PSNI budget itself?
Yes, and it's about taking people away from their day-to-day work to do it. But what I would say is it's really important in terms of the priority, as we know through the Programme for Government and Policing Plan, about tackling ending violence against women and girls, but dealing with domestic violence and abuse more generally. When it's a priority, then you have to make sure that your staff are well skilled and confident about when they're dealing with victims, and if there is a risk to the victim or to their children, that the proper pathways are taken and the safety measures are put in place.
I guess maybe the police would say, just I'm not putting words in their mouth, but one argument could be made that frontline policing has to take priority. If your resources are absolutely stretched to the wire, which the Chief Constable is constantly telling us they are, then training for officers isn't going to be your top priority.
Well, this is frontline policing because it's whenever victims are reporting domestic abuse and violence, and it's about that first point of contact with the police and what happens when they do report it. And victims really need to be confident. This Act is about encouraging victims to come forward to make sure that perpetrators are dealt with and dealt with appropriately. So that first point of contact, as we know, your experience of when you contact the police or you reach out for help, it's vital that you feel supported and you feel heard and listened to, and there's action takes place after that. And if there are children at risk, that there are proper protections in place or support in place to help victims and their children through that.
Yeah, and as we say, the Operation Encompass, you're very happy with how that's been working with children. Just very briefly, the next review, next year, you might look at actual individual cases again, is that right?
We did a case file review in year 1, and I think it's important that we go back and look at that in year 3 to give that assurance about how individual cases are being dealt with, and to give that assurance across the criminal justice system as well. And also to stakeholders like political representatives. The Assembly was very clear about this Act and what they wanted it to do, and this review that we carry out on an annual basis is about giving that assurance that the Act is being implemented as intended.
Thank you very much indeed for coming in and having a conversation with us about it this morning. That's Jacqui Durkin, who is the Chief Inspector of Criminal Justice in Northern Ireland.